Okay, so we left off talking about functionalism and it's seeing society as a stable system. And when you start thinking about like stability, does stability necessarily mean uh, healthy? So does a stable system equal healthy system? So the critics, um, you know, would say that the functionalist perspective supports the status quo, and of course, the status quo typically benefits some people at the expense of others. And so this leads us into what is called conflict theory, which sees groups in societies engaged in a continuous power struggle for scarce resources. It asserts that society is composed of various groups and there are limited resources on the earth, and those groups fight over those resources. And once one group gains control over those resources, they recreate the social structure in their favor to ensure that they keep the resources and to keep the other groups from gaining those resources. So a lot of this goes back to the ideas of Karl Marx. Um, and so Marx saw economics as kind of the central force in social change, that everything was, the engine was economics, and that the culture kind of resided on top of the economic engine. And so as economic changes would occur, culture and beliefs and values will kind of lag behind those economic shifts. So as we move from hunters and gatherers, to pastoral societies, to agricultural societies, to industrial societies, and that sort of thing. So he saw that these were like stages in which humans gain power over nature, kind of moving from primitive society to slave state to feudalism, and then from feudalism we start to see people moving off farms into factories. We start to see the changes occur, the cultural changes. People at this time believed that families would be destroyed, and in some sense they were, right? So we have extended families kind of moving to smaller families. So you're fundamentally kind of altering these kind of basic norms and values of people because of this economic shift. And so, as I mentioned in the earlier lecture, this is during the Industrial Revolution where we start to see society. We start to see the social problems that emerge. Housing, poverty, disease, pollution, crime, homelessness, and so this is kind of where also where sociology. And Marx in particular, and others start to talk about like these changes and how these changes are kind of central to kind of our understanding of society. So Marx, when he saw these men, mostly leaving their father's farms or leaving off some other person's farm and moving into the city, um, they entered in a new kind of labor relationship with this new kind of emerging figure called the bourgeoisie, the factory owner, the ownership class, the owner of the means of production. So he saw two new social classes kind of emerging during this time period of kind of industrial capitalism. He had the bourgeoisie, those who own the factories, those who own the plants, those who own the means of production, and then you had the proletariat, those who were coming off the farms. They had nothing but their own labor, and they exchanged their labor for a wage, and they used that wage, to pay rent, buy food, that sort of thing. And so this dynamics, according to Marx, is setting itself up for conflict because the bourgeoisie and the proletariat have very different goals. The bourgeoisie, obviously, as a business owner, you want to maximize profit, and one of the best ways to maximize profit is to keep your labor cost low. But if you're a laborer, your goal is to continue to get raises and make more money. And so from the very get-go, Marx is saying that this new form of capitalism is kind of sowing the seeds of its own destruction by creating this conflict between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. So the capitalist stage is the next point in which humans gain power over nature. But he saw in this conflict between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat a conflict that wouldn't result in one winning or the other, but a new hybrid, a new synthesis between the thesis and the antithesis, um, in moving into what's called a socialist society. But he said that this transition will be very difficult because of a roadblock that exists between capitalism and transforming into socialism. And that roadblock mostly consists of the power of ideology. So ideology is kind of a story that we tell. It's a belief structure that prevents people from taking action to kind of create this social change. So if you think about the term ideology, a basic textbook definition is cultural beliefs that justify particular social arrangements, including patterns of inequality. People buy into those beliefs that justify stratification and inequality. And this leads to what Marx calls false consciousness. And false consciousness is this belief that you're over identifying as a worker with the ownership class, and that your personal failures are the result of your personal flaws, not a societal or structural issue, but it's because of you. And so you buy into the value system of the elite, is what Marx would call false consciousness. And so in Marx's time, he was really critical of religion, and religion was the ideology that was in place that prevented this social change, because ultimately religion creates stability. And again, you think, oh, well, stability is good, right? I mean, what's wrong with stability? But again, if you're at the top of the strata and you have all the resources, yes, stability is great. But if you're at the bottom of the strata, generation after generation, stability is not a good thing. Marx believed that religion created that stability. So, for example, if you had workers in a factory and you had the ownership class, not only would they own the factory, the ownership class would own the houses in which they would lease to his workers. The ownership class would own the grocery store, so you would pay your workers, and they would spend their money back in your store, so you make a profit on them that way, make a profit on them coming and going. And a lot of times the ownership class might put like a small town church for their workers. And so a lot of the theology that was kind of handpicked for the working class would be things like in the New Testament, where the preacher might get up there on the one day a week that the workers might have off on the Sunday, and empathize with them. Like, I know your life kind of sucks right now. You work 6 days a week, 12 hours a day. There's a lot of misery. There's a lot of hardship. There's a lot of pain. But guess what? When you die and you go to heaven, just guess what the streets are made of in heaven. Just guess what the gates of your mansion will be made of. So you got pearly gates, and you've got golden streets, and you've got all this stuff. All you need to do is hold on, and then when you die, you will get yours. And so what this does is it creates what Marx calls a sense of false consciousness. People would escape into religion just like people would escape into drugs. Like, oh, he says religion is the opium of the people. And what this does is it prevents any kind of meaningful social change. It prevents any kind of collective organization that could end capitalism. Marx believed that in order for class consciousness to emerge, where people started to identify with people in their own social class to create any kind of real social change, you had to shed this powerful ideology. So fast forward to today, modern conflict theory still uses kind of the framework of Marx to investigate factors of social class like Marx, but also race, ethnicity, age, etc., and they'll look at how these things are linked to unequal distributions of money, power, education, and social prestige. Some key ideas in the conflict perspective include things like conflict and the potential for conflict underlie all social relations. Social change is desirable, unlike functionalism, where social change is kind of seen as dysfunctional. So social change is desirable, particularly change that brings about a greater degree of social equality. The existing social order reflects powerful people imposing their values and beliefs on the weak. So looking at functionalism compared to conflict views of society. So a functionalist would look at these social institutions, government, religion, education, the economy, mass media, technology, all these things, and they would see these things as meeting the universal needs of people. Conflict theorists would say, yeah, that's what it once did, but a conflict theorist would say, no, those things are basically tools used by the elite to maintain their own dominance. They're used to maintain stratification and inequality. Once a group gains the resources, right? And so once that group gains resources, then they have the resources to get representation in government. Um, they have the resources to control curriculum and education. They have the resources to dominate the economy, what people watch and consume with mass media conglomerates. And they use these institutions to generate false consciousness, to make sure that people are satisfied with their position. It's not, again, they're not using religion as an ideology, they're using the ideology of the individual, like in America. Like, so an individual in the lower working classes, they don't, they're not waiting to die to go to heaven to get the riches. Now they're just saying, well, I'm not working hard enough. If I can work just a little bit harder, if I can work just a little bit longer, then I can also move up in social class, and I too can be a millionaire if I really, really try. And so that ideology of the individual becomes very powerful in holding people in a stratified place, and these social institutions kind of are used to generate that ideology. So let's take a look at one of them, for example, education. So how would a functionalist look at education? How would a conflict theorist look at education? And take something in particular in education, like the tracking system. If you're not familiar with tracking, it's like, some kids, go into AP classes, some kids go into AG, advanced, regular, that sort of thing. So what would a functionalist say about tracking? Well, they would say, well, this is very functional, right? Because what you're doing is at a micro level, you're allowing individual students to be met, to meet with teachers who can meet them at their ability level, and you kind of separate them out, and people with this ability can learn, people with that ability, and it's functional at that level. But it's also functional at the macro level, which a functionalist theory is supposed to be looking at, which is that not everybody in society can be a doctor or a lawyer. There also has to be landscapers and dishwashers, and if you're training everybody to be a doctor and lawyer, that's very dysfunctional. Not all the work is met, and that it's not an equal balance system. So you kind of set people up to kind of expect moving into positions of being a doctor or lawyer. You set others to expect to move into lower level positions, and so by your training everyone to do all the different positions, all those jobs are met, and there's this kind of balance, there's this kind of equilibrium. That's kind of a very functional look at tracking. A conflict theorist would look at this in a little different way. They was like, well, how do you decide, who goes into regular classes, who goes into AG classes? And a lot of times, people assume that it's based on some sort of standardized test or it's a teacher recommendation. But, in a public school system, all one really has to do is go down and ask the school to put their child in an AG class. And by law, they have to do this because they're taxpayers too. But what usually happens is that, mostly it's middle class and upper middle class parents who know this because they themselves have education. They have degrees, like the child's teachers have degrees, whereas working class parents are typically intimidated by the school system, by teachers, and they just think they know best. And so what happens is disproportionately you have upper and upper middle class kids in these higher tracks, and you have lower working class and working class kids in the lower tracks. And so school basically reproduces the social class system. And so this is what a conflict theorist would look at. So conflict theorists would ask, who decides which student into which track and who benefits. And a lot of times a conflict theorist, they're asking the question, who benefits from this arrangement? And oftentimes what you'll see is that the system is set up in such a way that certain groups tend to benefit by the way that the status quo is set up. And so there's just always this challenge of the status quo. Well, maybe we need to restructure this in some way to be more equitable, for others to have at least access or an opportunity. So functionalist conflict theorists both looking at macro level analysis and both looking at it through very different lenses. All right.